STAAR Science Tutorial 44, TEKS 7.10c Succession. TEKS 7.10c Observe, record, and describe the role of ecological succession, such as in a microhabitat of a garden with weeds. In an ecosystem, a habitat is the place in which an organism lives and finds all of the resources necessary for its survival. Examples of habitats include a saltwater marsh, an open meadow, or an oak forest. Many different species can live in a habitat, though each species will probably spend most of its time in specific small areas of the habitat called microhabitats. Examples of microhabitats include a rotting log laying in the forest, the leaves and flowers of certain plants in a meadow, the top branches of an oak tree in the forest, or the litter on the forest floor. Microhabitats provide specialized requirements for a limited number of species. A community is all of the living organisms that live in an area. Each population of species within the community interacts with one another in interconnected food webs and symbiotic relationships, the biotic factors of the ecosystem. In a healthy ecosystem, the population of each species of the community is in equilibrium, that is, balance, with one another. The limited resources of the ecosystem, the established niche of each species, and the predator-prey relationships of the ecosystem tend to keep each population within a narrow range. This stable community is called a climax community because once achieved, it tends to continue with little change. The normal equilibrium ends when a disturbance or catastrophic event occurs within the ecosystem. Examples of disturbances include wildfires, hurricanes, floods, extreme droughts, volcanic eruptions, human habitat destruction, and glacial action. After such a disturbance, natural processes slowly work to restore the ecosystem to equilibrium. This process, called succession, is the series of predictable changes to the community that occur over time until a new climax community is established. There are two kinds of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. They differ with the severity of the disturbance, and in particular, whether soil exists in the ecosystem after the disturbance. Primary succession begins with exposed solid rock with no layer of soil in which plants can start growing. The disturbances that begin primary succession include volcanic eruptions with lava flows, receding glaciers leaving bare rock, and newly uncovered land caused by tectonic uplift or dropping sea levels. Pioneer species, such as lichens and moss, which can live on bare rock, slowly break down the rock into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually creating a thin layer of soil over the rock. As more soil is created, the size of plants that can be supported increases, from moss and grass to small shrubs and finally trees. Each new community of plant life helps to build up the soil in depth and fertility, making life for the next plant community possible. Each new successive plant community brings its own animal community. The primary succession process is very slow because the creation of soil can take thousands of years and is subject to erosion forces until a protective covering of plants holds the soil in place. The following flow map describes the steps in primary succession in terms of plant cover and soil thickness. In the first diagram, no plants lead to pioneer species, and then to grass, and then shrubs, and finally trees. The soil thickness begins with no soil, bare rock, and then proceeds to thin soil, thicker soil, and finally very thick soil capable of supporting trees. Secondary succession begins with an existing layer of soil in place. The disturbances that begin secondary succession include wildfires, human habitat destruction such as the clear-cutting of a forest, extended droughts, or floods. Because an existing layer of soil is already in place, secondary succession is a much faster process. The first plants may sprout from seeds in the soil that survive the disturbance, or may be dropped by birds or the wind. Within a few years, grass and wildflowers cover the ground and stabilize the soil. Shrub and tree seeds take root within a decade. If the climax community is a grassland or meadow, succession may only take a few years or a decade. If the climax community was a hardwood forest, it may take 100 to 200 years for the series of different plant communities to restore the ecosystem to equilibrium. Here, pine forests are eventually replaced by a hardwood forest. The flow map for plant communities in secondary succession follows. No plants in existing soil is replaced with grass and annuals, then shrubs, and finally softwood trees and hardwood trees as the climax community. Note that no significant change to soil depth occurs in secondary succession unless erosion immediately after the disturbance removes some of the soil. An example of a microhabitat is a vegetable garden in a residential yard that has been abandoned. Over a short time, weeds and grass seeds fall onto the bare soil and begin to sprout. Within a few months, grass and weeds have completely overtaken the once empty garden plot, returning the area to its pre-garden state.